A rancher lived isolated 20 years until 6 mail-order brides arrived and changed his life. For 2 decades, his ranch sat in silence, just dust, wind, and the weight of grief. But one broken wagon at his gate brought voices, laughter, and hope into a house that hadn't known joy in years. Yet on the frontier, nothing stays safe for long. Those 6 women carried more than dreams of marriage. They carried a letter, a claim that could spark a war. Suddenly, the railroad men and cattle barons wanted their land, their water, and their very lives. Now the rancher must face the fight he's run from for 20 years. Can a broken man protect 6 strangers who just might become his family? Or will the past and the powerful tear everything away before love and faith can take root? When the gun smoke clears, what price will be paid for redemption? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The pale light of dawn crept through frost-glazed windows as Frank Boone stirred in his cold bed. His weathered hands pulled the heavy quilt closer, though he knew sleep wouldn't return. It never did, not since Martha passed 20 years ago. The wind whistled through the eaves, a lonely sound that matched the emptiness in his heart. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he made his way to the kitchen. Frank struck a match, touching it to kindling in the iron stove. The familiar routine brought little comfort. Outside, his breath clouded in the crisp morning air as he trudged to the barn. "Morning," he muttered to the horses. They nickered softly as he filled their feed bins with hay. The repetitive motion of currycomb against hide soothed him, as it had countless mornings before. His stallion, Thunder, pressed against his shoulder, seeking treats. "Ain't got nothing extra today," Frank said, his voice rough from disuse. The horse's warm breath ghosted across his neck as he checked hooves and legs with practiced care. After the horses were tended, Frank gathered his tools. A section of fence needed mending where winter storms had worked posts loose. The sun climbed higher as he dug and tamped, muscles burning with the familiar work. It was mid-afternoon when he heard it, the distinct creak of wagon wheels on the rutted road. Frank straightened, shading his eyes against the harsh light. A covered wagon sat, tilted on the road, one wheel clearly broken. His first instinct was to turn away. Other folks' troubles weren't his concern. But something made him look again. 6 women huddled together on the wagon seat and in the back, their bonnets unable to hide their worried expressions. Even from this distance, he could see how they trembled in the cooling air. Frank's boots felt heavy as lead as he approached. "You ladies having trouble?" The words felt strange in his mouth after so long alone. "Oh, thank heavens," one woman breathed. She was older than the others, with silver threading her dark hair. "We've been stuck here for hours. Our driver, he took our money and disappeared in the night." The youngest woman, barely more than a girl, wiped tears from her dirt-smudged cheeks. "We're mail-order brides, headed to Paradise Valley." But now, her voice cracked out. Frank studied the broken wheel, noting how the spokes had splintered beyond repair. The sun was already sliding toward the horizon, painting long shadows across the empty land. Night would bring freezing temperatures and prowling coyotes. "My ranch is just over that rise," he said finally, the words coming slow and hesitant. "You can shelter there tonight." Relief washed over their faces. Frank helped them gather their belongings, noting how little they had, just small carpet bags and bundled quilts. The walk to his ranch was silent save for the scuff of boots on hard-packed earth. When they reached the house, Frank pushed open the heavy door. The women peered inside, taking in the sparse furnishings. Cobwebs draped the corners of the parlor like tattered lace. A thick layer of dust coated the piano that hadn't been touched since Martha died. "It ain't much," Frank said gruffly, suddenly conscious of the neglect. "But you're welcome to what there is." "We're grateful for any shelter," the silver-haired woman said quietly. The others nodded, clutching their bags close. Frank built up the fire and pulled out what food he had: beans, salt pork, and the last of his cornbread. The women insisted on helping, their movements careful in his kitchen. Soon, the smell of warming food filled the house. Supper was a quiet affair, broken only by the clink of spoons against tin plates. Frank kept his eyes on his food, unused, to company. Then, soft as a whisper, one of the women began to sing. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound! One by one, The other women joined in, their voices twining together in the familiar hymn. Frank's spoon clattered against his plate. Martha had loved that song. She'd sung it while working in their garden, while rocking in her chair, while teaching their son Thomas before the fever took them both. The harmony filled every corner of the room, chasing away shadows he hadn't even noticed. Frank's chest grew tight, his vision blurring. Without a word, he pushed back from the table and retreated to his room. Behind his closed door, Frank sank onto his bed, the hymn still drifting through the walls. 20 years of carefully maintained solitude crumbled like dry earth in his hands. He pressed his palms against his eyes, but couldn't stop the memories. Martha's laugh, Thomas's small hand in his, the way music had once filled this house with joy. The singing faded to silence, leaving Frank alone with his thoughts and the sound of his ragged breathing. Outside his window, the wind continued its mournful song through the eaves, but somehow it didn't seem quite as lonely as before. The morning light barely touched the horizon when Frank woke to unfamiliar sounds drifting through his house. Clatter of pots and the soft swish of brooms reached his ears. For a moment he lay still, memories of Martha mixing with the present reality of six-stranded women under his roof. The scent of fresh coffee drew him from his bed. In his kitchen, he found the women already hard at work. 2 swept the wooden floors with determined strokes, while others hung blankets on the line outside, letting the crisp morning air freshen them. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," said the silver-haired woman he'd noticed yesterday. "I hope you don't mind. We wanted to earn our keep." She stood at his stove, her capable hands wrapped around the coffee pot's handle. "I'm Micah Hartwell, by the way." Frank cleared his throat. "Coffee smells good." He accepted the tin cup she offered, the warmth seeping into his calloused hands. "These are Sarah and Beth," Micah continued, gesturing to the young women sweeping. "Lucy's outside with the blankets, and Emma and Rose are gathering eggs, with your permission, of course." Frank nodded, watching as Micah moved about his kitchen with quiet confidence. Her movements were efficient, practiced, like someone used to making the best of whatever situation she found herself in. "Reckon I ought to show you folks around," he said after finishing his coffee. "There's work needs doing in the barn." The women followed him outside, their skirts brushing against the frost-covered grass. In the barn, Frank demonstrated how to work the pump for the horses' water and where he kept the feed. Micah asked sensible questions about the daily routine, while the others listened intently. "Used to be a seamstress in Ohio," Micah shared as they walked the corral fence. "After my husband passed, I taught school for a spell. But sometimes a fresh start is what's needed." Throughout the day, the other women's stories emerged like spring flowers pushing through snow. Sarah, the preacher's niece, spoke of helping her uncle tend to his flock. Lucy, a farmer's daughter, knew her way around vegetables and animal husbandry. Each revelation painted a picture of strong women seeking something more than what life had dealt them. Frank found himself listening more than he had in years. He showed them the root cellar, the tool shed, and the chicken coop. Each space seemed to wake up under their attention, as if the house itself was remembering what it meant to be a home. When evening approached, Micah organized supper preparation. The kitchen filled with warmth from the stove and the subtle harmony of women working together. Frank sat at his table, watching as they moved around each other with practiced ease, setting out plates and cups. Once the food was ready, a simple but filling meal of beans, cornbread, and preserved peaches, Micah stood at her place. "Shall we give thanks?" she asked softly. Frank's hands tightened on his chair. He hadn't said grace since Martha died, hadn't been able to find words of gratitude in all these years of emptiness. But now, as Micah's clear voice filled the room with a simple prayer of thanksgiving, he found his head bowing of its own accord. "Lord," he whispered, so quiet he could barely hear himself, "thank you." The words felt strange on his tongue, like a key turning in a long rusted lock. After supper, while the others cleared away dishes, Micah paused by the parlor doorway. Her eyes settled on a trunk pushed against the wall, its wood dark with age. Frank saw her notice the initials carved into the lid. Martha Boone?" "She asked gently." Frank nodded, something catching in his throat. That trunk held all he had left of Martha, her Sunday dress, their son Thomas's baby shoes, the family Bible with its careful records of births, marriages, and deaths. He hadn't opened it since the day he'd locked away those memories, too painful. To face Mika didn't press for more, just nodded thoughtfully before returning to help with the dishes. But Frank stood looking at the trunk long after she'd gone, remembering how Martha had loved to fill their home with song and prayer, how she'd believed in gratitude even in hard times. The sound of soft conversation and quiet laughter drifted from his kitchen. Frank realized his house felt different tonight, warmer somehow, as if 20 years of silence were finally beginning to thaw. The familiar ache of loss still lived in his chest, but alongside it, something else stirred. Something that felt almost like hope. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Frank gathered the women near the well, its wooden frame weathered by years of sun and wind. The metal bucket hung ready, waiting to be lowered into the cool darkness below. "Water's precious out here," Frank explained, demonstrating how to work the well's mechanism. "Got to draw it careful like, make sure the rope don't fray." His large hands moved with practiced ease as he showed them how to lower and raise the bucket without splashing. Mika stepped forward first, her movements precise as she copied Frank's technique. The other women followed, each taking their turn until they could manage the task on their own. Frank watched, nodding in approval as they mastered the rhythm of it. Later, behind the house, Frank set up logs for splitting. "Firewood's next," he said, showing them how to position the axe. "Aim for the natural splits in the wood." He demonstrated, the axe head glinting in the morning sun before it struck true. Splitting the log clean down the middle. Sarah, the youngest, tried first but struggled with the weight of the axe. "Like this?" she asked, her arms trembling with the effort. "Stance is important," Frank said quietly, showing her how to plant her feet. "Let the axe do the work." While the women took turns practicing with the axe under Frank's watchful eye, Annie Whitlow returned to the house to organize her trunk. The leather-bound container held everything she'd brought from home: quilts, dresses, her mother's Bible. As she lifted out a stack of carefully folded linens, a yellowed envelope fluttered to the floor. Annie picked it up, frowning at the unfamiliar paper. The name Martha Boone was written across the front in elegant script. Her heart quickened as she unfolded the document inside. "Miss Mika," she called out the window. "Could you come see this?" The other women gathered around as Annie read the letter aloud. The formal language spoke of water rights downstream, properly filed and signed at the county office 15 years earlier. Martha Boone's signature graced the bottom, along with an official seal. "This could change everything," Lucy whispered, her eyes wide. "Legal claim to water means protection for crops, for livestock, for all of us," Sarah added. The women exchanged meaningful looks. They'd all come west seeking security, a chance at a new life. Water rights could mean the difference between survival and failure on the frontier. That evening, after supper was cleared away, Mika remained at the table with Frank, the lamp cast. Soft shadows across the wooden surface as she carefully placed the letter before him. "Annie found this today," she said gently. "We thought you should see it." Frank's weather-worn hands trembled slightly as he picked up the paper. His eyes moved across the words, recognition dawning in his features. "Martha's writing," he said softly. "She always did have a fine hand. The claim was never used?" Mika asked, watching his face carefully. Frank shook his head. "After she passed, I couldn't. There was so much." He fell silent, struggling with memories. "A legal claim like this could protect the ranch," Mika said. "Could protect all of us who might make our homes here." "Ain't that simple," Frank replied, his voice rough. "Water rights bring trouble sometimes. Folks get mighty particular about such things out here." "But it's legal," Mika pressed. "Your wife had the wisdom to secure it. Maybe she knew someday it would be needed." Before Frank could respond, Lucy burst into the kitchen, her face flushed with alarm. "Riders on the ridge," she exclaimed. "I saw them when I was closing up the chicken coop." Frank moved to the window, his frame tense. Through the pre-dawn gloom, dark figures could be seen moving along the ridge line. Even in the dim light, their purpose was clear. Survey equipment glinted on their saddles. "Railroad men," Frank said grimly. "Been pushing through these parts lately, buying up land where they can, forcing folks out where they can't." "The water rights," Mika said quietly. "They could mean more than just protection for us. They could be the difference between keeping the land and losing it." Frank stood silent, the letter still in his hand. The weight of Martha's foresight, her final gift to the ranch, seemed to press down on him like a physical thing. After 20 years of choosing solitude, of letting the world pass him by, he was suddenly faced with a choice that could affect not just his future, but the futures of these 6 women who'd stumbled into his life. The riders moved along the ridge. Like shadows, their presence a clear warning of changes coming to the valley. Frank carefully folded the letter, his decision settling into place like the pieces of a puzzle long left undone. Dawn had barely touched the horizon when Frank hitched the wagon. Micah and Annie climbed up beside him, their shawls drawn tight. Against the morning chill, the wheels creaked as they set out for town, the sound echoing across the empty prairie. "Best we handle this quiet-like," Frank said, his voice low. "No need to stir up trouble before we know what's what." The journey took 2 hours, the sun climbing higher as they traveled. Annie clutched the letter close, while Micah watched the PA landscape roll past. Frank sat straight-backed, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The town emerged from the prairie like a collection of wooden blocks, the general store, the telegraph office, and a whitewashed church spire rising above the other buildings. Frank guided the wagon down the dusty main street, passing the blacksmith shop where the ring of hammer on anvil filled the air at the county office. A bell tinkled as they entered. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up from his ledger. "Frank Boone," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Been a good while since you darkened this door." "Need to check on something, Henry?" Frank replied, nodding toward Annie, who stepped forward with the letter. The clerk adjusted his spectacles as he examined the document. His eyebrows rose. "Martha's water claim," he murmured. "Filed it proper, she did. Everything in order." He shuffled through a large leather-bound book, running his finger down columns of faded ink. "Still holds, never been challenged or transferred. Legal as the day she signed it." Frank's shoulders tensed as 2 men entered the office, their boots leaving dusty prints on the wooden floor. They tipped their hats but lingered, clearly interested in the proceedings. "Much obliged, Henry," Frank said quickly, retrieving the letter. He ushered Micah and Annie toward the door, feeling the weight of curious eyes upon them. Outside, the street had grown busier. As they walked back to the wagon, snippets of conversation drifted after them. "Boone's got water under his hand," someone whispered from the saloon doorway. The words seemed to ripple through the crowd like wind through prairie grass. The return journey felt longer, the wagon wheels kicking up dust as they hurried home. The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Frank gathered everyone in the kitchen after they arrived. "Word's out," he said grimly, his voice tight with concern. "Need you all to keep your eyes sharp. No wandering off alone, especially near sunset. Keep the doors latched at night." Supper that evening was a quiet affair, broken only by the clinking of spoons against bowls. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, their haunting calls echoing across the darkening land. The women exchanged worried glances as they cleared the table. Later, in the parlor, the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Most of the women had retired upstairs, but Micah remained, watching Frank as he stared into the flames. "You cannot keep living like this, Frank," she said softly. "Like a ghost haunting your own life." Frank's jaw tightened. "Been managing just fine, have you?" Micah's voice was gentle but firm. 20 years of silence and solitude, is that what Martha would have wanted for you?" "You don't know what she would have wanted," Frank snapped, but his voice held more pain than anger. "I know she left this claim to protect the land, and whoever might call it home," Micah replied. "She was thinking of the future, Frank. Maybe it's time you did too." Frank stood abruptly, moving to leave, but Micah's words followed him. They echoed in his mind like the distant coyote calls, impossible to ignore. As he reached the doorway, sounds of soft singing drew his attention. In the lamplight of the parlor, the women knelt in prayer, their voices rising in harmony. Annie's clear soprano led the familiar hymn, while the others joined in, creating a melody that seemed to push back against the darkness gathering outside. Frank stood frozen, watching them. The scene stirred something deep within him, memories of Martha kneeling in this same room, her own prayers filling their home with hope and purpose. The women's voices wove together, creating a shield of sound against the night's uncertainties. He remained there, silent and unseen, as their prayers continued. The lamp's glow surrounded them like a protective circle, while beyond the windows, the vast prairie stretched into darkness. In that moment, Frank felt the weight of his solitude press against him, even as Mika's words echoed in his thoughts, challenging the walls he had built around his heart. Morning came with a golden haze. Across the prairie, Frank stood on his porch, watching the sun climb above the horizon. The sound of boots on wooden floors and quiet chatter drifted through the open door behind him. It was time to prepare these women for ranch life. "Can't have you helpless out here," Frank announced after breakfast, leading the group toward the corral. "Need to learn the basics of survival." He gestured to the line of rifles propped against the fence. "Starting with these." Several of the women stepped back, eyeing the weapons warily. Lucy, the youngest, let out a nervous giggle that echoed across the yard. "Nothing to fear from a tool you understand," Mika said calmly, picking up one of the rifles. Her hands moved with surprising confidence over the metal and wood. Frank nodded approvingly. "Widow's got the right of it." He demonstrated proper handling, showing them how to check if a rifle was loaded, how to aim, how to breathe steady before pulling the trigger. "Like this?" Annie asked, squinting down the barrel at a distant fence post. Her arms trembled slightly under the weight. "Lower your right elbow," Frank instructed, his voice gentler than usual. "Breathe slow, like you're saying a prayer." One by one, the women practiced. Some shots went wild, others found their marks. Through it all, Mika moved among them, adjusting stances and offering quiet encouragement. After the shooting lesson, Frank led them to the barn. "Horse sense comes next," he said, helping each woman mount up. Some sat stiff as boards, while others leaned too far forward or back. Sarah nearly slipped off entirely, catching herself with a startled yelp. "Think of it like dancing," Mika suggested, settling easily into her saddle. "Move with the horse, not against it." They practiced basic riding skills, learning to check fence lines and identify problems. Frank showed them how to spot broken posts, loose wire, and signs of cattle trying to break through. The autumn sun climbed higher as they worked, warming the cool morning air. "You're doing fine," Frank found himself saying more than once, surprised by his own patience. When Lucy successfully tied off a length of loose wire, he actually smiled, brief as a lightning flash, but real. By late afternoon, the women had graduated to more complex tasks, identifying different types of tracks, recognizing weather signs, and understanding the layout of the ranch's water sources. Their confidence grew with each new skill mastered. "Reckon you all ain't completely hopeless," Frank admitted as they rode back to the house. The comment earned him a knowing smile from Mika that he pretended not to notice. While Frank tended to the horses, the women attacked the parlor with determined energy. They threw open windows, letting in fresh air and sunlight. Dust cloths snapped, brooms swished, and old oil lamps were restored to gleaming life. Sarah and Annie discovered a trunk of bright fabric squares, leftover quilting materials from years past. Soon, cheerful cloth hung across the windows, transforming the harsh prairie light into soft, colored patterns that danced across the floor. Frank's boots stopped dead in the doorway when he returned from the barn. The parlor, so long a shrine to emptiness, now hummed with life. Lamplight caught the polished surfaces of tables and picture frames. The colored window hangings cast warm shadows on walls that had been bare for 2 decades. Someone had placed wildflowers in a jar on the mantel. His throat tightened. The room reminded him of Martha, but not in the painful way he'd grown used to. Instead, he remembered her joy, her determination to make their house a true home. "Supper's ready," Mika called from the kitchen, breaking his reverie. The meal that followed was unlike any Frank had known since Martha's passing. The table was full, plates passing hand to hand. Lucy told a story that made everyone laugh, even Frank managing a chuckle. The sound surprised him. He'd almost forgotten what his own laughter felt like. Later, as they washed dishes together, Frank turned to Mika. "Need to tell you something," he said quietly. "These cattle barons, they won't just give up on that water. They're used to taking what they want, and they don't much care who gets hurt along the way." Mika's hands stilled in the dishwater. The other women gathered closer, listening. "We ain't scattering," Annie declared, her chin lifted high. "Not after coming so far," Sarah nodded firmly. We've learned more today than I thought possible. We'll learn whatever else we need to. Together, Lucy added, reaching for Sarah's hand. Frank looked at their determined faces, lit by the warm glow of the newly polished lamps. These women who'd arrived as strangers now stood united, turning his empty house back into a home. Something, long dormant, stirred in his chest, a feeling of belonging, of purpose. "Well then," he said gruffly, "reckon we'd best keep at those shooting lessons." The women exchanged quiet smiles, understanding the acceptance in his words. Outside, the prairie wind sang through the evening shadows, but inside, the house glowed with newfound warmth and life. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the prairie grass silvered with dew. As the women bustled about preparing breakfast, Mika paused by Frank's chair, her hands folded neatly in her apron. "We ought to attend services today," she said quietly. "The church spire's been visible from here all week." Frank's jaw tightened. "Been 20 years since I set foot in that building." "Maybe that's long enough," Mika suggested, her voice gentle, but firm. The other women gathered nearby, hope bright in their eyes. Frank looked at each face in turn, then pushed back from the table with a heavy sigh. "Reckon I'll hitch up the wagon," he muttered. The road into town stretched long and dusty. Frank sat rigid in the driver's seat, his Sunday best coat feeling stiff and foreign after so many years in the chest. Beside him, Mika wore her best dress, carefully pressed. The other women had done what they could with their travel-worn clothes, helping each other with hair and bonnets. The church bell tolled across the prairie as they approached. Frank's hands tightened on the reins when he saw the crowd of townspeople filing into the whitewashed building. He helped the women down from the wagon, conscious of the stares and whispers that followed their progress up the wooden steps. Inside, the congregation's heads turned as one. Frank stood frozen in the doorway until Mika's gentle touch on his arm guided him forward. They filled an entire pew near the back, the wood creaking beneath them. Preacher John Keats had just opened his Bible when he spotted Frank. His weathered hands faltered on the pages, and he stumbled over the first verse. But the old circuit rider recovered quickly, his voice growing stronger as he spoke of redemption and prodigal sons returning home. "The Lord's mercy knows no limits," Keats declared, his eyes finding Frank's. "His grace falls like rain on barren ground, bringing new life where hope seemed lost." Frank sat stiff-backed through the sermon, but his hands gradually unclenched in his lap. When the congregation rose to sing, he remained silent, yet his foot tapped softly to the familiar hymns that stirred long-buried memories. The whispers followed them out after the service. "Boone's got himself a whole household now," one woman muttered. "6 ladies no less," another added. Frank hurried the women toward the wagon, his face dark with discomfort. The autumn sun hung high as they traveled home. Wind rustled through the dry grass, carrying the sweet scent of late wildflowers. Mika sat quietly beside Frank for a while before speaking. "Faith asks much of us," she said thoughtfully. "It takes courage to believe, both within church walls and beyond them, but we're never alone in the trying." Frank's shoulders remained tense, but he nodded slightly, acknowledging her words. Back at the ranch, the women changed from their Sunday clothes and gathered behind the kitchen. They carried precious packets of seeds saved from their travels, parsley, sage, thyme, and mint. Working together, they cleared a small patch of earth. "Might not amount to much before winter," Sarah admitted, pressing seeds into the soil. "But come spring," Lucy added hopefully, "we'll have fresh herbs for cooking." "If we last the winter," Annie murmured. "When we last the winter," Mika corrected firmly. Patting the earth's smooth dot as dusk painted the sky in deep purples and blues, Frank found Mika alone on the back porch. She stood watching the newly planted herb garden, a lamp casting soft light around her. "Been thinking on what the preacher said," Frank spoke quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "About mercy and such." Mika waited, letting him find his words. "When Martha died," he continued, "I cursed God. Believed he turned his back on me, taking her like that. Shut myself away from everything. People, faith, hope itself." His voice cracked slightly. "Reckoned I was abandoned." "Perhaps," Mika answered softly, "God was waiting for this moment, waiting until your heart was ready to open again." Frank stood silent, but in the lamplight, tears gleamed in his eyes. He blinked hard, looking out over the darkening prairie, where coyotes began their evening songs. The lamp flame flickered between them, casting warm shadows across the porch boards. Neither spoke again, but something shifted in the silence, like a door long rusted shut creaking slowly open. Inside the house, the other women's voices drifted out, harmonizing on an evening hymn. The notes floated across the prairie darkness, a gentle reminder that faith, like hope, could bloom again in the most unexpected places. Dawn painted the sky in gentle pinks and golds as Frank led the women to the barn. The familiar scent of hay and horses filled the cool morning air. He showed them how to check the leather harnesses for wear, running weathered hands over the straps and buckles. "Got to make sure everything's sound," he explained, demonstrating how to secure the traces. One weak spot could spell trouble on the road. The women gathered close, their skirts rustling as they practiced with the heavy harnesses. Some struggled with the weight, but determination showed in their faces. Frank moved among them, adjusting their grip, nodding approval when they got it right. "Like this?" Sarah asked, lifting a collar. "That's the way," Frank answered, gentle but firm. "Horse has got to trust your hands." Inside the ranch house, Mika organized the women into a sewing circle each evening. They gathered around the parlor table, needles flashing in the lamplight as they mended Frank's work clothes. The pile of worn shirts and jackets slowly transformed under their careful attention. "Lord have mercy," Lucy exclaimed, holding up a particularly threadbare shirt. "How long have you been wearing these, Mr. Boone?" Frank ducked his head, embarrassed. "Make do with what I have," he mumbled. "Well, now you have us," Mika said firmly, her needle dipping and rising steadily. The other women nodded in agreement, their hands busy with patches and darning. As darkness settled over the prairie each night, they gathered around the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as stories flowed. The women shared tales of their journeys west, of families left behind, of hopes carried carefully like precious seeds waiting to be planted. One evening, as the fire burned low, Frank cleared his throat. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. He stared into the flames, his voice rough but steady as he began to speak. "Was barely 20 when I came out here," he said slowly. "Martha and me, we had such dreams. Built this place together. Stick by stick." His hands trembled slightly as he continued. "She filled these rooms with singing. Always singing, that woman was. Even when times got hard, she'd find something to laugh about." Mika sat close beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. The other women leaned forward, their faces soft with understanding as Frank described how the laughter died with Martha, how silence crept in like winter frost, how years slipped past in lonely shadows. The quiet moments shattered at the thunder of hoofbeats in the yard. Frank was on his feet in an instant, moving to the window. 6 riders sat their horses in the darkness, lanterns casting ugly shadows across their faces. "Boone," the leader shouted, "come out and talk business." Frank's jaw tightened as he recognized the railroad men from town. He stepped onto the porch, leaving the door open behind him. The women huddled in the doorway, watching anxiously. "Nothing to discuss," Frank called back. "This is private property." The leader's laugh was ugly. "Private property? With you harboring these stray women? Mighty suspicious situation you got here, Boone. These ladies are under my protection." Frank's voice was steel. "And that water claim is legal." "Legal don't mean much out here," another rider sneered. "This ranch will be railroad property soon enough. Might want to think about that before you get too comfortable playing house." Frank's hands curled into fists. "Get off my land," he ordered. "Now." The riders wheeled their horses, but the leader lingered. "Think on it, Boone. Railroad's coming, one way or another. Hate to see anything happen to your guests." They thundered away into the darkness, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by the nervous stamping of horses in the barn inside. The women huddled together, faces pale in the lamplight. Mika stood tall among them, her voice steady as she began to pray. "Lord, grant us courage in this darkness," she spoke clearly. "Shield us with your strength. Guide our steps with wisdom. Let no threat shake our faith in your protection." The other women's voices joined hers, gaining strength as they prayed together. Frank stood by the window, his fists still clenched as he watched for any sign of the riders returning. "No one's taking this land," he vowed quietly. "No one's taking any of you." Mika moved to stand beside him, her presence steady and calm. "We stand together," she said softly. "All of us." Frank nodded, his shoulders straight and determined as he continued his vigil at the window. Behind him, the women's prayers rose like a shield against the threatening darkness beyond. Morning light filtered through wispy clouds as Frank led the women to the back pastures. The dry grass whispered beneath their boots, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage. He carried several rifles, the wood stocks worn smooth from years of use. "Single action," he explained, demonstrating how to load the cartridges. Slower than newer guns, but reliable if you treat them right. His weathered hands moved with practiced ease, showing them how to check the cylinder and handle the weapon safely. The women formed a line, their faces set with determination as Frank positioned wooden targets against a distant hill. Sarah, the youngest, flinched at her first shot, but squared her shoulders for the next try. Lucy proved a natural, her aim steady and true. One by one, they learned the rhythm of load, aim, and fire. "Keep the stock firm against your shoulder," Frank instructed, adjusting Annie's grip. "That's it. Breathe out slow when you squeeze the trigger." Hours passed as they practiced. The morning sun climbed higher, and their shoulders grew sore from the rifle's kick. Still, none complained. Even when blisters formed on tender hands, they persisted, understanding too well what was at stake. "We ain't giving up," Hannah declared, rubbing her aching shoulder but reloading anyway. The others nodded, their faces showing the same fierce resolve. By midday, Frank had them breaking down the rifles for cleaning, teaching them to care for each part. Their hands grew confident with the tools, and pride showed in their eyes as they reassembled the weapons properly. Later, while Frank worked on the barn roof, the women's voices drifted up to him. He paused in his hammering, listening as Mika's calm tone soothed the younger one's fears. "Remember Moses leading his people through the wilderness," she was saying, her voice steady and sure. 40 years they wandered, facing trials we can scarce imagine, but the Lord provided. He guided their steps, gave them strength when hope seemed lost. "But what if the railroad men come back?" Sarah's voice trembled. "Then we face them together," Mika answered firmly. "Our strength comes not just from rifles, but from faith and unity. Like Ruth said to Naomi, 'Where you go, I will go.' We're family now." Frank's hands stilled on the shingles, something tight catching in his throat at her words. The sound of hymns rose from below, the women's voices joining in harmony as they worked. Evening brought a different kind of music to the ranch. Hannah retrieved her fiddle from her trunk, its varnished surface catching the lamplight as she tuned the strings. The first notes danced through the air, a lively reel that had feet tapping against the wooden floor. Lucy knew the tune and began to sing, her clear voice carrying the melody. Others joined in, some clapping, some humming parts they remembered. The parlor, so long silent and dark, now glowed with warmth and song. Frank sat in his chair by the fire, watching the scene before him with wonder. These women who had arrived as strangers now moved like family, their faces bright with joy despite the dangers they faced. The music swelled and dipped, weaving through the room like a living thing. As the evening wore on, the tunes shifted to hymns. The familiar words of Amazing Grace filled the air, and Frank found his own voice joining softly, remembering how Martha had loved this song. The lanterns burned low, casting gentle shadows on the walls. Most of the women had retired, leaving Frank and Mika alone by the dying fire. The quiet between them felt comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. "I hardly recognize this place anymore," Frank said at last, his voice rough with emotion. 20 years of silence, and now, he gestured helplessly at the room around them. "And now?" Mika prompted gently. "Now I'm terrified," he admitted. "Terrified of losing all this life that's come back. But I feel alive again, really alive, for the first time since Martha died. And that scares me even more." Mika's smile was soft in the firelight as she turned to face him. "You were never meant to live alone, Frank Boone. God created us for community, for sharing both burdens and joys." Frank looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, the wisdom in her eyes. His heart stirred with feelings he had thought long buried, emotions he had no words to express. The silence stretched between them, filled with things unsaid. Finally, he managed to nod, unable to voice the confusion and hope warring in his chest. Mika seemed to understand. her presence steady and patient beside him as the fire's last embers glowed in the darkness. The first hints of spring touched the ranch with gentle fingers. Tender green shoots pushed through the thawing earth where the women had planted their herb garden. Even the air felt different, carrying the promise of warmer days ahead. Frank and Mika walked the eastern fields together, their boots crunching on the last patches of morning frost. The sun cast long shadows behind them as they discussed where to plant this year's crops. Corn would do well here, Mika said, kneeling to crumble the dark soil between her fingers. The ground's rich enough, and we could dry plenty for winter. Storage. Frank nodded, surveying the land with experienced eyes. Wheat too, if we're careful. My father used to say this valley could grow anything, long as you respected its ways. They continued their planning, marking boundaries with wooden stakes, when the thunder of hooves drew their attention. 3 riders approached from town, their horses kicking up dust along the road. Frank recognized Marshal Haskins' tall frame in the lead, his badge glinting in the morning sun. "Stay behind me," Frank murmured to Mika, stepping forward as the men dismounted. The marshal's boots hit the ground with deliberate force. "Boone," he said, voice carrying the weight of authority. "Got business with you and them women you're harboring." Frank's jaw tightened. "They ain't being harbored. They're guests in my home. That so?" Haskins pulled a folded paper from his vest, then explained why none of them's registered proper with the county. "Got here a warrant citing vagrancy laws." He thrust the document toward Frank. "And while we're at it, seems there's some question about your property taxes these past years." Frank's hands trembled as he read the warrant. Mika stepped closer, reading over his shoulder, her breath catching at the words. "This is nonsense." Frank growled. "My taxes are paid regular as sunrise. Got the receipts to prove it." The marshal's smile didn't reach his eyes. Records showed different. "Way I see it, you got 2 choices. Either them women leave peaceful like, or we escort them to town where they'll be properly placed in suitable situations." "Placed?" Frank's voice rose with anger. "Like cattle at auction?" "Now, don't get riled," Haskins said smoothly. "Just doing my duty to protect vulnerable females. Ain't proper, them living here without proper arrangements. They are under my protection." Frank's words cut through the air like steel. "Protection?" The marshal laughed. "From a man who can't even keep his own property? Ranch'll be seized for. Them back taxes less you can pay up quick. Where's your protection then?" Frank took a threatening step forward, but Mika's hand on his arm held him back. The marshal's deputies shifted, hands moving to their gun belts. "You have 3 days," Haskins announced, mounting his horse. "Either the women go, or we'll remove them proper like. Your choice, Boone." They watched the riders disappear down the road, dust settling in their wake. Frank's fists remained clenched, his face dark with fury. That evening, the women gathered in the parlor, faces drawn with worry as Frank explained the situation. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls as they debated their options. "We could try for California," Sarah suggested, her young voice trembling. "Start fresh where nobody knows us." "Running ain't the answer," Hannah argued. "We got rights same as any folk." Lucy huddled deeper in her shawl. "But what if they force us out? Where would we go?" "Nobody's forcing anyone," Frank's voice was firm despite the fear gnawing at his gut. "I'll ride to the county seat tomorrow, show them my tax receipts. This is just railroad men trying to squeeze us off the land." "And if that doesn't work?" Annie asked softly. Frank stared into the fire, shoulders heavy with the weight of responsibility. "Then I'll find another way. You got my word on that." Mika watched him from across the room, seeing the strain beneath his brave words. As the others drifted off to bed, she stayed behind, moving to stand beside his chair. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said quietly. Frank looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I brought you all into this. Your safety's my burden to bear." "No." Mika's voice was gentle but firm. "Courage grows when shared, Frank Boone, like a garden tended by many hands." She touched his shoulder lightly. "We're stronger together than apart. That's what family means." Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and threatening. Thunder rumbled in the distance, like the approaching hoofbeats of unwelcome riders. The wind picked up, rattling the windows of their sanctuary, now so fragile in the face. of corrupt law and powerful men. Frank covered Mika's hand with his own, drawing strength from her steady presence as the storm drew closer. Dawn broke cold and gray over the ranch. Frank had just finished checking the barn when the first riders appeared. They came in force, 15 men on horseback, their rifles glinting dully in the weak morning light. At their head rode James Carleton, the biggest cattle baron in the territory, his silver-trimmed hat marking him clear as day. Frank's hand moved to his revolver, but he knew he was badly outnumbered. Behind him, he heard the creak of the ranch house door as Mika peered out. "Get back inside," he called without turning. "Bar the doors." The riders fanned out in a half circle, their horses stamping restlessly in the dirt. Carleton raised a folded paper. "Got the marshal's warrant right here, Boone," he drawled. "Time for them women to clear out. Ranch too, less you can pay what's owing." "You know damn well I paid every cent," Frank growled. "This is theft wrapped in paper, nothing more." A rifle shot cracked through the morning air. Splinters flew from the barn wall just inches from Frank's head. Several of the women screamed from inside the house. "That's your warning," Carleton said coldly. "Next one won't miss." Frank stood his ground, though his heart hammered in his chest. "This is my land. Get off it." Two riders dismounted, moving toward him with purposeful strides. Frank's hand tightened on his revolver, but before he could draw, a third man came up behind him. Pain exploded across the back of his head. He staggered, trying to turn, when a fist like iron slammed into his jaw. He tasted blood as he hit the dirt. Boots swung at his ribs, sending waves of agony through his body. Through dimming vision, he saw the house door fly open. Mika and Annie rushed out, Annie wielding a cast-iron skillet while Mika fired Frank's old shotgun into the air. The sound sent the horses rearing, scattering the riders momentarily. "Help me get him," Mika commanded. She and Annie grabbed Frank's arms, dragging him across the yard as he struggled to get his feet under him. His head spun, blood running hot down his face. More shots rang out, pocking the ground around them. They finally reached the house, other hands helping to pull Frank inside. Sarah and Lucy slammed the heavy door shut, dropping the bar into place with shaking hands. "Windows," Mika ordered, taking charge. "Make sure everyone is locked and shuttered. Hannah, we need bandages and water. Annie, help me get him to the bedroom." They laid Frank on his bed while he drifted in and out of consciousness. His ribs screamed with every breath. Through the fog of pain, he heard horses outside, men shouting threats. But the sounds seemed to come from very far away. "Margaret," he mumbled, seeing his late wife's face swimming before him. "Margaret, I'm sorry." Mika's cool hand touched his forehead. "Save your strength." The hours crept by like wounded animals. The women took turns watching the windows while Mika cleaned Frank's wounds, stitching a deep gash above his eye. Outside, the riders maintained their siege, occasionally firing into the air or shouting warnings. As night fell, they dimmed the lamps to avoid making targets of themselves. The darkness pressed close around them, broken only by occasional flashes of gunfire. Frank drifted in and out of fevered dreams, calling Margaret's name, reliving old memories of happier days. Through it all, Mika remained by his side. Her prayers filled the darkness with whispered hope. "Lord, give us strength. Protect this house and these people. Guide us through this valley of shadows." When false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Frank's fever finally broke. He woke to find Mika still kneeling beside his bed, her head bowed in prayer. The house was quiet except for the soft breathing of the other women who had finally succumbed to exhaustion. "Mika," he rasped, his throat dry as dust. She lifted her head, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank God. How do you feel?" "Like I lost a fight with a bull." He tried to sit up but fell back with a groan. "You need to take the women and go. When those men come back, no." Mika's voice was soft but carried the strength of steel. "We're not leaving you or this land. We'll stand together, come what may. They'll kill us all. Then we'll face that together too." She took his hand, her grip warm and sure. "You've been alone too long, Frank Boone. That ends now. We're family, and family stands together." Her words struck something deep in Frank's battered heart, kindling an ember of hope he thought long dead. For 20 years he'd carried his grief like armor, keeping the world at bay. Now, looking into Mika's determined face, he felt that armor beginning to crack. Outside, the first true light of dawn began to paint the sky. Frank squeezed Mika's hand, drawing strength from her unwavering faith. Whatever the new day might bring, they would face it together. The days following the attack settled into a watchful rhythm at the ranch. While Frank lay recovering in his bed, Mika stepped forward with quiet strength to lead their small household. Her calm voice directed the women through their duties, keeping fear at bay with purpose and prayer. "Lucy and Sarah, you'll take first. Watch at the windows," she instructed one morning, her voice steady despite the dark circles under her eyes. "Hannah and Annie will spell you at noon. Remember to stay back from the glass." The women moved with growing confidence, checking rifle loads and maintaining careful vigilance while still tending to daily chores. Mika had organized them well, some always watching while others cooked, cleaned, or tended to Frank's injuries. In the evenings, they gathered in Frank's room for prayers. Lamplight cast warm shadows as their voices joined together, asking for protection and guidance. Frank, though still pale and weak, found himself drawing strength from their unwavering faith. It was during one such evening that hoofbeats approached the ranch. The women reached for their rifles, but the rider called out before they could take aim. "Hello, the house. Henry Tsosi here with news from town." Mika peered carefully through the window shutters. In the fading light, she saw a well-dressed Cherokee man sitting tall in his saddle, his hands clearly visible and empty. "Preacher Keats sent me," he continued. "I'm a lawyer. Heard about your water rights trouble." After careful consideration, Mika opened the door. Henry Tsosi stepped into the lamplight, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. His calm demeanor and intelligent eyes put them somewhat at ease. "The preacher told me about the claim document," Henry explained, settling into a chair by Frank's bed. "I've been fighting the railroad's land grabs for years. If that water rights paper is legitimate, it could be exactly what we need to secure your ranch legally." Frank struggled to sit up straighter, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "The claims. Real enough, but Carlton's got the marshal in his pocket." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "True enough, but the territorial court is another matter. They're less easily swayed by local influence. I can help you file a proper case." "Court takes time," Frank growled. "Carlton's men won't wait." "No," Mika interjected, firmly, laying a gentle hand on Frank's shoulder. "You're in no condition to fight. We need to do this properly, through the law." Henry pulled papers from his satchel. "I'll need affidavits from all of you about the attack. And I've already started gathering statements from townspeople who've suffered similar treatment from the railroad men. There's more support than you might think." Over the next few hours, Henry took their statements one by one. The women described the threats, the violence, the false accusations of vagrancy. Each testimony added weight to their case. Later that night, after Henry had ridden back to town and the others had gone to bed, Mika sat beside Frank in the quiet darkness. The lamp burned low as she changed his bandages. "You don't have to carry this burden alone anymore," she said softly, noting the worry lines etched deep in his face. Frank was silent for a long moment. "After Margaret died," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion, "I swore I'd never risk loving a family again. Losing her nearly killed me." "God doesn't ask us to bear our grief alone," Mika answered, her hands gentle as she finished with the bandages. "Perhaps he sent us to you for healing, yours as much as ours." Their eyes met in the lamplight. Frank's calloused hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with shared understanding. In that moment, something shifted between them, a connection deeper than words, forged in shared struggle and growing faith. "I reckon I've been haunting this ranch like a ghost," Frank admitted, too afraid of loss to truly live. Mika squeezed his hand. "Then perhaps it's time to step back into the light." Their hands remained clasped, neither wanting to break the moment. The lamp flickered, casting warm shadows across their faces as they sat together in companionable silence. Outside, crickets chirped their evening song, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage through the window. In that peaceful moment, both felt the first stirrings of something new, a partnership built on both faith and the fire of shared adversity. Dawn broke cold and clear as two wagons rolled out from Frank's ranch toward town. Frank sat rigid beside Mika in the lead wagon, his wounds still tender but his jaw set with determination. Behind them, the other women huddled close, their Sunday best contrasting with the rifles laid carefully across their laps. The town's main street fell quiet as they passed. Shopkeepers paused in their sweeping, and mothers drew children closer. Outside the courthouse, Carleton's men lounged against hitching posts, their sneers visible even from a distance. Henry Tsosi met them at the courthouse steps, his dark suit and calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension in the air. "Remember," he said quietly, "let the document speak for itself." Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Judge Matthews, gray-haired and stern-faced, called the session to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. Carleton's lawyer rose first, his voice booming through the packed room. "These women are vagrants, Your Honor, and Boone here hasn't paid proper taxes in years. The railroad requires this water for progress." "Progress?" Carleton himself interrupted, standing up red-faced. "It's about law and order. We can't have wandering women setting up wherever they please." Judge Matthews silenced them with a raised hand. "Mr. Tsosi, your response?" Henry stood, straightening his jacket. "Your Honor, I present this water rights deed, properly filed and recorded 20 years ago." He approached the bench, document in hand. "Signed by Margaret Boone with all fees paid in full." The judge studied the yellowed paper, his expression unchanging. Minutes stretched like hours as he reviewed every detail. "The claim appears legal and binding," he finally declared. "Mrs. Boone's signature and the county seal are authentic." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Frank heard his neighbors arguing in whispers, some cursing Carleton's greed, others defending the railroad's plans. Mika rose next, her voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, if I may speak?" At his nod, she continued, "We're not vagrants. We're women who work that land daily, who've turned an empty house back into a home. We tend gardens, mend fences, and keep watch. We pray together and work together." Her quiet dignity touched something in the room. Frank saw several townswomen nodding, and even some of the men looked thoughtful. "The water rights stand," Judge Matthews declared. "This court recognizes Frank Boone's claim through his late wife's deed. Case dismissed." Outside, Carleton and his men blocked their path to the wagons. "This ain't over, Boone," Carleton snarled, but something had shifted. Townspeople moved to stand between Carleton's men and Frank's group. The general store owner, the blacksmith, even the preacher's wife, they formed a quiet wall of support. "Best move along, Carleton," the blacksmith said firmly. "These folks are under the law's protection now." The ride home felt lighter somehow, despite the lingering threat. That evening, they gathered around Frank's table, now scrubbed clean and set with their best dishes. Mika led them in a prayer of gratitude while lamplight danced across their faces. As they passed bowls of stew and fresh bread, someone told a small joke. Frank surprised himself with a deep, genuine laugh, the first in 20 years. The sound startled them all into silence before the women joined in, some wiping joyful tears from their eyes. "Lord above," Frank said, shaking his head in wonder. "I'd nearly forgotten what that felt like." The lamps burned bright in every window that night, their light a beacon of hope and new beginnings. New beginnings. Spring sunshine warmed the ranch as Frank and the women set about repairing the damage from Carleton's men. The sound of hammers rang across the yard as they replaced broken fence posts and mended the barn's splintered doors. Frank watched in quiet amazement as Mika directed the work with calm efficiency, her capable hands never idle. "Need some help with those repairs?" came a familiar voice. Frank turned to find Tom Wheeler, his nearest neighbor, leading his wagon up the drive. In the back, lumber and tools clattered with each bump. "Much obliged," Frank said, his voice rough with surprise. More wagons followed throughout the day. The Hendersons brought seeds for the garden, while the Miller family arrived with spare tools and willing hands. Even folks Frank hadn't spoken to in years showed up, offering help and hesitant smiles. The women's garden, once just tiny sprouts, now showed promising green shoots pushing through the dark soil. Mrs. Henderson knelt beside the youngest bride, showing her how to thin the seedlings. "My grandmother's method," she explained, "never failed yet." By mid-afternoon, the ranch hummed with activity. Children darted between workers, carrying water and small tools. The smell of fresh coffee and baking bread drifted from the kitchen, where several townswomen had joined forces with Frank's group. Preacher Keats arrived as the sun began to set, his wife Sarah beside him in their buggy. "The church roof's still giving us trouble," he explained, helping Sarah down. "I wondered if you'd consider hosting Sunday services here until repairs are done." Frank glanced at Micah, who nodded warmly. "Your folk would be welcome," he said. That evening, lanterns cast a gentle glow across faces gathered around the long table. After supper, Sarah Keats sat at the freshly tuned piano, a gift from the Millers. The first notes of Amazing Grace filled the room, and voices joined in natural harmony. Frank found himself singing too, remembering words he thought long forgotten. Looking around the crowded room, Frank felt his throat tighten. Children dozed in corners while their parents talked softly. The women who had arrived as strangers now moved about his home with easy familiarity. And Micah sat in the lamplight, her face serene as she mended a shirt. "Lord," Frank whispered, "thank you for second chances." Later, as the last guest departed and the women headed upstairs, Frank found Micah on the porch. Stars scattered across the dark sky like diamond dust, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. "Will you stay?" he asked quietly. "Beyond spring, I mean." His heart hammered against his ribs as he waited. Micah turned to him, her eyes soft in the porch lamp's glow. "Frank Boone," she said, "I already have." Their hands found each other in the darkness, fingers intertwining with quiet certainty. Together, they watched the eastern sky lighten, pearl gray bleeding into rose gold. Dawn broke over the ranch, painting everything in colors of promise, a future neither of them had dared to imagine now spreading before them like the new day. Soft June breezes rustled through the cottonwoods as the ranch blossomed with new life. The once empty buildings now echoed with purpose and joy. In the weeks since the court victory, love had taken root alongside the flourishing garden. Sarah, the youngest of the 6 brides, found her match in Tom Wheeler's son James, who had helped rebuild the barn. Martha caught the eye of the town's gentle blacksmith during Sunday services. One by one, the women who had arrived desperate and afraid found their hearts opening to honest courtship. Annie, the preacher's niece, stood radiant beneath the cottonwoods as she married David Henderson, a neighboring rancher. Frank watched from his place beside them, his weathered face soft with pride. The gathered townsfolk beamed as the young couple exchanged their vows. Then Preacher Keats raised his voice above the gentle breeze. "Frank Boone and Micah Hartwell, please step forward." Frank's heart thundered as he took Micah's hand. Her fingers trembled slightly in his grasp, but her eyes shone steady and sure. Lantern light caught the silver threads in her dark hair, woven with white wildflowers. 20 years ago, Frank's voice carried across the hushed gathering, I closed my heart to love and faith. But God sent 6 angels in a broken-down wagon to teach me hope again. He squeezed Micah's hand. I vow before God and these witnesses to never walk in silence again, to share your burdens and joys, to honor your strength and grace, and to love you until my dying day. Tears glimmered in Micah's eyes as she spoke her own vows, her quiet voice firm with conviction. Preacher Keats pronounced them husband and wife. As the setting sun painted the cottonwoods gold, the congregation burst into song, their voices rising in joyful harmony. Amazing Grace floated across the ranch yard, joined by the evening crickets and distant coyote song. Later, as stars began to jewel the vast prairie sky, Frank and Micah walked arm in arm back to the ranch house. Warm lamplight spilled from the windows, along with the sound of laughter and music. Young voices called out in play while older folks shared stories on the porch. At the threshold, Frank paused. The house that had stood as a silent monument to his grief now pulsed with life and love. He looked up at the star-strewn heavens, his heart full. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, drawing Micah close. "Thank you for sending 6 strangers to save a broken man, for turning 20 years of loneliness into a lifetime of family and faith." Micah smiled up at him, her face glowing with joy. Together, they stepped across the threshold into their new life, surrounded by the blessing of community and the endless promise of tomorrow. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.